Welcome back for another episode. I'm in the same park, but the scenery is quite different. As you can see, the sun is out, birds are singing, and some green is beginning to appear on the trees. My past videos have featured existentialist themes, and the one I have in mind for today will present at least a little bit of a brighter kind of mental scenery to go with this new springtime scenery. The topic that I have for today is the idea that comes out of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, that the self is internally constituted by its relationship to an other, and specifically constituted through its recognition by an other. And I'd like to contrast that idea with Descartes' Cogito and illuminate it a little bit more through Lacan's idea about the mirror stage. So let's just begin with Hegel. What Hegel does is he sets up a dialectic of self and other at the very, let's say, onset of his sense of what it means to be in the world. It isn't that he's taking the perspective of what we may know, searching for an axiom for our understanding, for our capacity to know, as Descartes does. What he's doing is something radically different. He's shifting the ground toward a phenomenological perspective, according to which what is at issue is our experience of the world, our experience of the phenomena of the world. And within that experience, we experience objects in the world. We experience other people in the world that you could say, in a Lacanian sense, serve to mirror us in one way or another by giving us a sense of difference. So when I encounter the other, when I encounter the look of the other, when I encounter the sound of birds, I notice otherness. And within that realization of otherness is a realization of my otherness from the objects of my phenomenological experience. And it is through those objects that I begin to constitute a sense of my own self. So you could maybe think about Lacan's mirror stage as a kind of metaphor. There are many things that are mirrors, many things that could serve as mirrors that hold up a revelation to us of how our own being in the world is constituted. The classic film example of this is in the movie Solaris, where one of the I can't remember if it's an automaton or who it is. I believe her name is Veronica. She sees herself in the mirror and has this moment of recognition she has a moment of self-recognition. So, out of this experience of otherness, you might say, develops a sense of being able to see oneself as who one is, and also how one is for others. And for Lacan, there's always a distance between those two concepts. There is this public self, and then there is the self as I experience it for myself. For example, people tend to put labels on people, or they tend to think about them in a certain way that may not capture their full reality. They don't see us as we see ourselves, or perhaps we might like them to see us in a way that we believe reflects our true self when we feel that they have misjudged us. So the distance between self and other serves both as a project for us, as well as a motivation, a motivating cause for our own social and psychological development, the development of the ego, as well as a constant need to return to ourselves to discover who we are, as our sense of ourselves is revealed by our interactions with others in the world. Now, what Hegel does in his discussion of lordship and bondage, which is also sometimes called the master-slave dialectic, is he points out that in human interactions, there is typically a kind of competition for recognition. One person may recognize the person more fully than another. And social relations being what they are, one may take a dominant position while the other takes a more subservient one. And that kind of situation has occurred throughout human history. So what Hegel is really doing there is kind of a phenomenological take on the origin of inequality. But what he ultimately wants to argue is that because both need the recognition of the other, turning to the original point that we are inwardly constituted by our need to be recognized by another, is that very need compels us ultimately to recognize the other as an other, as well as understand our own personhood in relation to others. So what ultimately arises out of this is a need to see the other as a self, as a genuine person, in a way that can be equated with one's own personhood. One finds one's own personhood more fully by the acknowledgement of personhood in the other. R.D.Laing wrote a book called The Divided Self, in which he argued that the symptoms of schizophrenia can be reduced to a non-recognition of self or a non-recognition of the other. He describes various symptoms of schizophrenia, or let's say symptoms that would be signs of the onset of schizophrenia. And one of them is a feeling of engulfment in relation to another. In other words, a feeling that one's own sense of selfhood is not quite, let's say, well structured enough or well formed enough in relation to the other. And the feeling is that one may be engulfed by the other. The other symptom he discusses is called impingement, which, to give a more visual metaphor, is kind of the idea that one's selfhood is contained in a defensive bubble, but might always be poked and somehow deflated by some experience from outside that bubble. And both of these states are neurotic states of worry, concern over the constitution of one's own sense of self. And in that state, you enter into a dialectical relationship with the other, where the master and slave dialectic reaches an acute state. So the last point I don't want to leave without mentioning is just how much different this Hegelian perspective is than the Cartesian perspective. Descartes, in his Cogito, begins with the idea that there is something called an I, and that this I is something that cannot be doubted. It's the foundation for all our subsequent knowledge, or it's taken to be, in as much as it is the thing which we can be most certain of. And so having the most solid foundation will give us least grounds for doubting the firmness of what is constructed upon it. But the problem for Descartes was always that he had difficulty showing how he could get from his inner consciousness, his own state of self-awareness of the I as a thinking thing, to a genuine acknowledgement of objects in the world as really existing in themselves, as things that cannot be doubted. And the only way he had of proving that they could be real things and not simply in his mind doubted away was by recourse to a proof of the existence of God and the idea that God was not a deceiver. A benevolent God would not be a deceiver. And many have had their qualms about that line of argument, which doesn't seem quite as well founded as the Cogito itself. So there's this problem for Descartes about getting to the world as it is, and within a phenomenological perspective, the phenomena of the world are simply taken as given, as the only world that we have access to. Other beings are beings in the world, and our psychic development, the development of our consciousness, the development of our own sense of ourself as something separate and different from the other as a thinking thing, depends, it could be argued originally, on that phenomenological experience and not on the prior, let's say, axiom of knowledge that the Cogito prescribes as a basis for firm knowledge. So Descartes can't get out of his own inner perceptions, let's say, to a genuine sense of the world as something that's really there. Hegel is able to do that simply by adopting a phenomenological perspective, which could arguably be said to be the more prior and more foundational concept. So with that, I will leave off.